Hello everybody, welcome to The Take. I'm your host, Krishna Mano, and in today's episode, I will be interviewing Dr. Rebecca Rolland, a speech pathologist, psychologist, Harvard lecturer, and the author of The Art of Talking with Children. Dr. Rolland, thank you so much for joining me in today's episode. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Great, thanks for having me here.
Could you please tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do now?
Sure, yeah. So I'm the mom of two kids, ages 6 and 11. I'm also a speech language pathologist, and I teach at Harvard at the education school and in the medical school.
Thank you. And for viewers who don't know, you were recently interviewed by El Pais for an article about how, in the status quo, children's ability to think creatively is fading away into roboticism, and this is heavily due to social media and the internet. So could you please explain from an expert's point of view how social media plays a role in draining this creativity from kids?
Sure, yeah. So I recently wrote the book, The Art of Talking with Children. And as part of that, I did a lot of research with psychologists, speech pathologists, social workers, and so on, and lots of interviews with parents and kids. And I really have found that the ways we use social media and the overall busyness of our lives makes it very hard for us to have meaningful conversations where kids are not just following directions or sort of following orders, but are actually able to work in a more open-ended way and play, where they're able to create and come up with ideas and not just follow directions. I think there's many reasons for this, but there's social media as one, as is sort of the overstructuring of everyone's lives, where kids don't have a lot of chance for free time.
Right, and what do you think drives this necessity for kids to be on social media? Why do you think that kids feel the need to just keep going back to these social platforms?
Yeah, I mean, I think for one, it's a natural urge to connect, especially as, teenagers often do, their friends become very important. And as someone's peer group is all doing it, so say my friends are all doing it, then it's really difficult, I think, to feel like I'm the one left out or I'm the one not up on the trends or not commenting. And so I think that it's partly sort of a spiral that gets created as some kids start, there's more and more postings, and then it feels as if you have to keep up. So I think we have to start not just person by person, but really thinking at a broader societal level about how we can change some of these things.
Exactly. And that also leads to the point of self-control, because a lot of teenagers who are on social media are yet to develop that skill of being able to say, okay, I'm going to set a time limit on this app and this app. And I myself struggle with self-control sometimes. So our family has set up like these time limits on social media to ensure that we're not on it too long because of the negative impacts that you were talking about.
Definitely, yes. And I think there's many ways to do that. And one is just to set time limits for oneself or for each other, because I think it does all come down to sort of a whole family unit. So I really like the fact that you're talking about all your whole family setting time limits, because I think if it's just the kids and then the adults are on their phone or on their devices all day, it sets a really difficult precedent and makes it really hard for the kids to feel included as sort of not just having their devices shut down. So I think really it does take the whole family to do this.
Definitely. And now that we've discussed the problem itself and its impact on everyone in the family, but especially young adults, what can be done to solve it? What exactly will it take to limit social media's negative effects on these young adults?
Yeah, so I think in part it is starting even at the highest levels with the government. So I think it's really important for there to be more regulations, that things are not just allowed, to be open and, free all the time. I think at the same time, given what we already have, it's important that we help kids develop their own self-control and self-awareness about how the viewing of social media, especially in participating, is affecting them. So having conversations, for example, about, how do you feel when you've been scrolling on TikTok for that long? Or how do you feel when you see all of these things on Instagram? So actually helping kids think critically about that, as well as I think the distinction between the image and the reality. So helping kids see that if you see all of these perfect images, it's very likely that that's not really what's happening behind the scenes. So starting to develop some of those critical thinking skills, I think, is really important as kids get older and realize, oh, well, this is going to be a part of their lives.
For sure. And touching back to what you were talking about of like at the federal level, the government intervening, the U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy recently issued a new advisory about the effects of social media on the mental health of teenagers, with up to 95% of young adults reporting using a social media platform, and more than a third saying that they use social media almost constantly. Do you think that government regulation of social media will be beneficial to reducing the amount of time that these young adults are on these platforms? And do you even see that being a possibility in the near future, given that America is so polarized in the modern world?
Yes. I mean, I do think that it's a possibility, and I think it's sort of one piece of the puzzle. So I wouldn't say, oh, that's the only answer. I definitely think it could be helpful. I think another big piece of the puzzle is what some schools are doing to say that we're going to limit or even exclude phones and social media devices from the school hours because kids are at school so much. And where they're there, they have the chance for in-person gatherings, for talking, for socializing, sports, and all of these things that develop skills in a very different way. So I think if we can at least make headway there and actually start to have these conversations at home, we can really start to cover, school and home, and creating more of a dialogue too between school and home. So maybe teachers can talk about if they're seeing an issue with the student, they talk with the parents and the student and say, oh, well, what are we noticing here? And what kind of trends are maybe problematic, so that there's more fluid communication about these things.
Definitely. And what you say makes sense, given that, we can pair these solutions that the family comes up with, because that's where students are for a majority of their life. And we can pair that with what these schools and teachers are coming up with, because if they're not at home, they're probably at school. And combine that as like a government regulation, that makes total sense.
Definitely. Yeah. I think if we see it as multiple things going on at the same time, rather than thinking, oh, there's one solution, we'll be much further on our way.
Right. And going back to that family bit you were talking about previously, as someone who has researched social media's effects on children extensively, what are the main alarms you would raise to parents who are raising the future generation?
Yeah. So I would first just caution parents that I and a lot of other social media researchers are not saying all social media use is bad. So sometimes kids and adults, we are connecting with others, we're making new friends, we're reaching out to old friends on social media. So it's not as if all of these things are bad or wrong. So I think it's important to take a really collaborative tone when you talk with kids, to realize sometimes these things can be helpful, sometimes they can be harmful, and sort of to really start to analyze and piece apart what about it might be harmful. And especially to notice, so some of these warning signs I would say are if a kid is feeling really withdrawn or is on their phone a lot and is not wanting to do other activities, sort of it's taking over in-person activities, or if it's really hard to have a conversation because your child is always looking at their phone or is in the middle, can't stop scrolling, that kind of thing. Or even comments like, oh, I'll never be as good as this person, or I will never have what this person has. So that's suggesting that a child probably is starting to compare themselves to other people based on what they see on social media.
Right, and that comparing part you were talking about is what I think drives a lot of teenagers towards going back to social media, because I myself have a few friends who are always talking about, oh, this person's going to vacation in Mexico, or this person's on a cruise. And I think that always like affects kids in a different way, because like I said, we haven't developed those skills yet of self-control and understanding that we should be happy with what we have.
Yeah. And I mean, I agree with you. And I think it's actually funny because I think it's equal for adults in a lot of ways. I think it can be really hard if you're in the middle of a work day and somebody else is in the Bahamas, or something like that, So I think it's not just kids that have that issue, but really it's hard, I think, to feel like, oh, we see these, perfect versions of other people's lives, and it's really hard not to compare. So there is a lot of research suggesting, especially for teenagers, that comparison and that sense of not being good enough really is harmful to mental health.
Definitely. And I know over the course of this interview, we talked a lot about the negative impacts of social media and mental health. So to hopefully end this interview on a lighter note, I found out that you are a writer and poet as well. So as an author, what is your most favorite book and why?
Yeah, so I've recently been reading a lot of children's literature, and I would say I really enjoy the book Holes by Louis Sachar. I feel like it's somewhat of a dark book and not something I would have expected kids to initially like, but I really enjoyed it, and the kids I've read it with have also really enjoyed it, and kind of the ironic humor that's throughout it.
Definitely. And when I first read it, I remember just going through this roller coaster of emotions because it makes you feel sad at some parts, kind of silly at some parts, and like very dark at other parts.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rolland, for joining us on today's episode of the show. It was a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks so much. Best of luck.
Thank you.